Good morning. Appreciate y'all coming out today to listen to this. I found this, I'll start with, a difficult presentation to do because, I have editorial comments which are more personal opinion, which if it offends anyone, I apologize ahead of time. These are my personal opinions that I wanted to provide. And then I also have a flow of information that I want to impart in this presentation. So what I decided to start with was, first of all, the dynamic and influences to consider, which are really heavily influenced by my own personal opinion, which then as we go through the presentation, I'll try to back up with actual facts. First and foremost that's out there are party dynamics. Both Republicans and Democrats have intra-party dissension. It's out there. You saw it first really on the Republican side with the Tea Party Freedom Caucus crowd. You're seeing it now on steroids on the Democratic side with the Democratic Socialists. And along with that, I'll put in there the urban-suburban crowd that the Democratic Party is rapidly becoming a more urban-suburban party than it is a rural party or an agriculture party. Both of those have broad implications on the way they affect the House and Senate and the way they affect the Ag Committee jurisdiction. On the House, you remember there's 435 House districts. Those are, discrete districts within the state. It's easier to carve out a suburban-urban district where the population is. So the House is much more heavily influenced by, and has a much greater contingent of what you would consider more left, strong left, vocal left representatives than does the Senate, where you have to represent a whole state. And I don't care what state you're in, you do have a little bit of agriculture somewhere. So you generally try not to upset the rural population too much. And where you'll see that really affected is, on the House side, the House Agriculture Committee particularly, if you look at representation. When I first went up to Congress way back when, I worked for a rural Democrat, Kika De La Garza, and on the House Ag Committee, we were heavily represented by what they call blue dog Democrats, which were conservative Democrats. Nowadays, there's a large, if not majority contingent of representatives that represent urban and suburban, some with no agriculture at all. And they're much more focused on issues like nutrition, the domestic side, than they are on production agriculture. You haven't seen this on the Senate side with their Ag Committee jurisdiction and with their Ag Committee representation. It's pretty much a typical, Senate representation. The other things that I would have you consider as I go through this is election dynamics. The pollster, campaign consultants, etc., are all still uncertain on how to exactly measure the effect of social media and technology on campaigns. The traditional way of measuring this is not accurate. And I would hold as an example the 2016 election where Hillary was going to win and Trump was going to lose. That's still out there. Some people have a little better, or some of these, high-priced campaign consultants have a little better handle on it, but it's still, they just aren't as comfortable as they used to be on the metrics that they used to use in regard to, this is where you are, this is what you need to do, this is where the electorate is going. Okay, and then you have the presidential election dynamics. Nothing says it more. Y'all get it on the news every day about what's happening in Iowa. I will tell you the good thing about, or I say good thing, the interesting thing about having Iowa as first in the nation. As a Southerner who always had to discuss ag policy with a state that is, heavily influenced by agriculture, is that in Washington, Iowa is overrepresented in D.C. And it's because of this first in the nation presidential politics. You have presidential candidates talking about agriculture that, were they not in Iowa, you wouldn't hear a peep. And they're really not comfortable doing it, but you got to do it to get through the Iowa door. And I'll use as an example how they can shift candidates. One of the, in the past candidates was John McCain. He was always anti-bioenergy. And all of a sudden he had to go through that Iowa door and he wasn't anti-bioenergy anymore. It's amazing how that can happen. If it seems that D.C. doesn't understand agriculture, you're right, they don't. Agriculture, we're less than 2% of the population. We're getting even a smaller share. I'll use as an example, when I was in college at Texas A&M University, if you weren't from a family that, was involved in agriculture, my buddies their parents were involved in agriculture or their grandparents, okay? If you look, with my daughter, and when she went to school, you're talking about, now a lot of times, if you have a grandparent, you're lucky. Most of the time it's great-grandparents. So you have a whole population out there that has no idea of what production agriculture really entails, what it's like, what it needs. And as a result, they're very much influenced, or can be very much influenced by, what I don't think of as reality. It may be web reality, but it's not reality that you have to deal with. Then for you to think about, these are issues that I consider are possible game changers, and I call them existential threats to agriculture, because these issues, depending upon how they handled, will change agriculture as we know it nowadays. Maybe for the good, maybe for the bad, you just don't know. It depends on how it ends up. First and foremost is how we respond to climate change. We are going to respond to climate change, okay? And the question is who does it and how they're going to do it. One thing I can assure you, though, is of all the responses that I've heard and I've seen, is we're not all going to die in a mass extinction in 10 or 11 years. That ain't going to happen, okay? That being said, we're going to address climate change. And the question is, where does agriculture fit in there? How do we want to fit in there? And what is the most common sense way for us to fit in there? Another thing that I find that scares me in dealing with agriculture is this antipathy to technology. And I don't care whether it's GMO, whether it's use of chemicals, whatever you want, any of these cutting edge, the frankenfood, the absolutely silly, unscientific issues that people take as fact that have the ability to affect trade, whether it be the European Union's ability to block some of our imports, some of our exports, because of the use of technology. It's a huge game changer, and we're going to have to figure out a way to address that. Our response to consolidation. I put this up there because there's a lot of candidates out there that are now talking about consolidation. And depending upon where you are in the whole consolidation discussion, that can mean markets, that can mean processors, that can mean banks, that can mean, and depending on how they address that, that can be a huge game changer in agriculture, both in the way we market our products, the way we sell our products, the way we obtain credit. So that can be a huge game changer. And then last of all, what I want to leave you with is something that no one's really talking about. Republicans or Democrats, is our response to the federal budget. We have a huge problem. We have a $22 trillion debt that's hanging out there. That's money we spent. It's on our credit card. We're paying interest on it. Okay? And to further exacerbate the situation, every year we're digging that hole deeper and we're adding another $1 trillion in debt. This year I think it's up to 1.2 or 1.4 trillion dollars. If we have some kind of economic change which requires us to pay a little more in interest than what we're paying now, that will have a huge effect on the funding that we have to address discretionary programs in Congress. So that was kind of background I wanted to leave, and then what I want to do is go through, and if it seems to you that Congress isn't doing anything or they're really not doing anything important, they aren't. This is a chart. I'm trying to find a nice way to say it, and sometimes you just got to lay it out there. Okay, on this shows a chart of, the 110th Congress. So we're talking over a decade of congressional sessions. This is, bills they've moved, and you can see in this Congress, they've done very little. Okay, so what does that mean? What I tried to do is I pulled out, on the House side, it's Democratic leadership, so these are Democratic priorities. So let's talk about, these are Democratic priorities and things that they've done. This is overall Big House. And then I'm going to take it down and do agriculture specifically. Okay, they reformed campaign ethics and voting rights. Okay, that was H.R. 1, and you can see that it passed on a vote of 234 to 193. Okay, that was one of their big initiatives that they sent over in the Senate. Reducing drug prices. Both sides agreed that this needs to be done. It's a huge problem. The House did a bill, they passed it. They sent it over to the Senate, and it passed on a vote of 230 to 192 in the House. Addressing climate change. Now, they haven't quite found a way to figure out to get forward with the Green New Deal, but they did pass this Paris climate change. And you look at it, it passed on a vote of, what was that, 231 to 193, okay? Went over to the Senate. Raise the minimum wage, same thing, 15, the House passed it. Another 230-something to 190-ish passage. Let's look at what they agree on. What they agree on is they want to do something on infrastructure. Pelosi, Schumer, Trump agreed on that back in March. They haven't done anything, okay? The Democrats recently, I think yesterday, came out with a proposal that'll spend billions of dollars on it. They can't move on this. Why is that 230, 190 number important? Because if you look at the makeup of the House, 232, 197, you can see every single one of those bills is highly partisan. And as a former legislative director, chief of staff, counsel, whatever, there's strategies you use to pass a bill. And sometimes when you pass a bill from one body to another, the thought is, I want to come in with the strongest negotiating position possible. And that way, when I go to conference with the Senate, I will have the ability to negotiate from a really strong position to their position, whatever it is. And I'll end up further closer to mine than if I cut a deal ahead of time, if I compromise ahead of time. The problem with that rationale is sometimes these bills are so partisan and so, far to the left that people get dug in on positions and you can't touch them. And that's basically what's happened with these bills over in the Senate. They've gone over to the Senate, and because they're that 230, 190-ish number on all of them, they don't move. They just sit there. So let's look at the Senate and what have they been doing. Okay, first and foremost is to confirm Trump nominees. And on this, I'm going to go ahead a little bit because I want to show they've been very successful on this from a judiciary side. If you look at this, Trump's, his nominees, McConnell, they've gotten them through, boom, boom, boom. They're passing them. This is largely a result of a reform Harry Reid made back when he was Speaker, when the Democrats were in charge, where he took away the filibuster for judicial nominees, except for Supreme Court. Then the Republicans came in, and this is a concern. I'm raising this now because it changed the dynamic of considering these nominees and of nominees going through. Now, it happened in a good way in that, they've been able to get nominated, from a Republican standpoint, they've been able to get nominees that would be held up. But, what you worry about is in D.C., one thing I've learned, every dog has his day. And what happens when the shoe is on the other foot. I also wanted to point out the administrative nominees. These are presidential nominees that go and run the departments, these show a huge lack of appointees. For the third year in a presidential term, these should be filled. That shouldn't be 168. That should be, in single digits, if not double. These are the president's people that you send to the department to run an agency, and if you believe in the deep state and career bureaucrats are not doing what they're supposed to do, these are your boots on the ground to make sure they do it. And you can see how many, in really high positions are not appointed. What does this mean for agriculture? In agriculture, we have 13 positions that need to be filled. As of now, 5 are unfilled. 2 of them are what I considered administrative, more or less, that you really wouldn't feel like chief financial officers. You're not going to notice that. But some of these are substantive positions. And they're positions like the Undersecretary for Research and Education. That's a chief scientist in the department. The Undersecretary for Food Nutrition Service. That's, school lunch, food nutrition. I mean, we don't have an undersecretary there. Now, I won't lay this all on the Senate because some of this is Trump's ambivalence to forward nominations. And he just doesn't, this administration hasn't considered it a priority like past administrations have. But it is not a good situation in that you need your people on the ground watching how the bureaucracy is implementing your policies. So on nominees, like I say, on the judicial side, they've done a good job. Ratifying USMC, got it done. That was a big unknown. And then here's another infrastructure thing that's coming up. That the Senate, it's a priority, just like it is in the House. Haven't done anything. I use that as an example of even when they agree on something, they can't get it done. They agree on it, they can't get it done. Last, and probably what is the biggest overhang, is the Trump impeachment. And y'all are hearing about that more and more. And one of the reasons why they're at such a crucial point at this point in time is because of, they're the process. And where they are right now is there's 16 hours of questions, where both sides are open. Once that wraps up, then they'll have another 4 hours of debate or discussions on whether or not they call witnesses. That has a huge influence on what's going to happen in this session of Congress. It's an unknown right now. There's 6 senators that they consider as, questionable on how they'll vote on more witnesses or subpoenaing documents or not. And you can see, Romney, Gardner, Lisa Murkowski, Lamar Alexander, Susan Collins, and then McSally from Arizona. Whether or not they're they've made up their mind. You know, maybe inside they have, but they are cited as, well, these are people that could vote for additional witnesses. And if they do vote for additional witnesses, the reason why that's important is because if you look at this congressional calendar, all the colored slots is the time they have left to do business, okay? So you'll see in January, you don't see any Senate business done. And that's because when you're impeaching somebody, you got to impeach them. You don't go and do other things and then come back, you know? So the Senate cannot conduct business as long as they're impeaching the president or holding in the impeachment process. Right now, the conventional wisdom was this would wrap up the end of January, the 1st of February. If they do witnesses, and once they make a decision on that, then I think it's really uncertain about how long this takes. And you could see all those colored days in February evaporate, and March, and April, and May, just depending on how many they call. Witnesses on the Senate side are a very lengthy, they interview them privately, you know, well, first of all, you're going to have to figure out from the courts, can you call them? I mean, it is going to be a long, drawn-out process. So what does that mean for stuff we have to do? Okay, and this is where I wanted to look, I want to focus on. This is stuff, agriculture, the Senate Agriculture Committee, the committee with jurisdiction over things that we care about. These are things they have to do this Congress. First and foremost is child nutrition. And I say that with a thought in mind is there are authorizations that if you can't do them, and this goes back to a lot, you know, the 230, 190, the change in, you know, the flavor of the House. If you can't pass legislation, you know, the dynamic is if the legislature can't legislate, well then it's status quo. And I don't care what you're talking about. If you're talking about child nutrition, you're talking about immigration, you're talking about, you know, defense. The general rule is, and pretty much hard and fast rule is, if you can't legislate, it's status quo. They have not been able to legislate since 2015 on child nutrition. That's when that expired. The Commodity Exchange Act, CEA, that governs CFTC, it expired in 2013. They have not been able to reauthorize it. Fortunately, on programs like that, if the appropriators come back and give it money, it's assumed that it's reauthorized at the same time in the same manner. So these have been chugging along on autopilot since 2015 and 2013. These are programs that are supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years so that you can improve them and reform them if you need it. Now, there are 2 programs that expire this year that aren't quite in that situation. One is the U.S. Grain Standards Act, and the other one is livestock mandatory reporting. I will particularly point to livestock mandatory reporting, if any of you are livestock people. That is important. And that has an actual effect on markets because that CEA Act above, you know, where all our futures and, you know, what governs our futures trading, a lot of the contracts that are traded on the futures exchanges are based on information they get on mandatory livestock reporting. So if that is not reauthorized, then it affects your ability to hedge in the livestock market. Another priority I'll throw out on the Senate side, this is a chairman's priority, and it's MBAF, it's a National Bio and Ag Defense Facility. This is a facility in Kansas. He is a retiring chairman. He wants to improve it, reform it, and get it money. So it's going to appear in somewhere. Whether or not it'll get through is unknown, but it will appear. It's one of his priorities. On the House side, you pretty much see the same priorities as the Senate, absent child nutrition, because the House doesn't do child nutrition and Labor doesn't. I will note that on the House side, they have moved on the Commodity Exchange Act, and this is, you know, talking about the dynamic of the committee and the dynamic of the full House. Okay, the Ag Committee was able to weave through and by unanimous consent, report out a CEA reauthorization, a Commodity Exchange Act reauthorization. It goes to the House. Before it can get to the floor, you have the more liberal ring of the Democratic caucus going, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not doing this. Before we do this deals with all those really rich people on Wall Street and out in Chicago. And before we deal with this, we're going to discuss something like a financial transaction tax. So as a result, at the moment, this is sidelined. Will it get to the floor? Is anybody's guess. But those are the pressures that leadership has to deal with if they want to enact anything on the House side. So what I'm getting into now is, you saw how many days they have to act. Are there other actual bills that Congress has to do so that the republic doesn't end? Yes. And first and foremost of that is the appropriations bill. And this is, they haven't started it yet. That's typical because they generally don't start until the president does his budget in February. What is not typical is this budget is controlled by a 2-year budget deal that they cut previous Congress, which is why last Congress they got the appropriations bill through after doing a continuing resolution, because there was an additional over $50 billion that they could spend on programs. Okay? So if you do a CR, remember, if you can't act in Congress, status quo. What you get is status quo. You get baseline spending. Okay? They were able to reach an agreement and fund last year, because if they didn't, they would have gotten status quo and they would have lost the $50 billion. This year, there's no sweetener. They're pretty much flat funding. I think they have an additional $1 billion to spend. So the conventional wisdom on this is, the appropriations committees will mark up bills, but you won't see any substantive action on any of them until after November. Because what happens in November? The election. And depending upon who wins in November, they'll do a CR at the end of September that will last to November. And then depending upon November, that will determine if they do another CR until January 1st, or they do a lesser one to hurry up and get it done before Congress changes. Why would they wait? Well, if you're on the Democratic side and you don't want a wall, you don't have to discuss wall funding. You'll have the ability to put in appropriations language that prevent it. So, there's a big unknown about how they'll be able to address this. Other things they have to do this year, FISA expires. Y'all have heard about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This is a thing that got Carter Page and the Trump campaign in trouble originally. It's expired. People want to reform that. Otherwise, it goes away. The FAST Act. Now, this is the real infrastructure bill. The other infrastructure bill that everybody is talking about, that the Democrats have put out, are aspirational infrastructure bills. We want to spend more money. This is money that's there, that if they don't reauthorize it, when you're looking at September 30th, there are roadway programs that will not be able to continue because there'll be no money. There's healthcare programs there that also need to be reauthorized. You can see them. And then last but not least is NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That tells you how you're going to spend money on defense. That has to be done. The other thing I'll throw up that would be a nice thing for them to do is ag immigration. And the good thing about ag immigration is the House has passed a bill. What I'll have you to particularly note is they passed it on a vote of 260 to 165. We're not in the 230, 190 range. What that means is it was a bipartisan bill that went over to the Senate. And while immigration is fraught with, there's reasons to hate this, there's reason to like this, most people consider this a positive step forward in addressing our ag immigration problem and issues, that now that it's over on the Senate, because it is a bipartisan bill, they could possibly find a way to weave it through and get it enacted. Still unknown, but could happen. Then the last thing I want to touch on is these big picture 2020 Senate races. I'll touch on the Senate first. There are 35 Senate seats up for election this time. Remember, a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. It's a continually sitting body. 23 of those are Republicans. Those are all the ones that are up for re-election. What's important, and I'll pull out two particularly. If you look at Colorado and Maine, those are important. And if you remember, the Colorado, Maine senators were also in the impeachment discussion about will they vote for witnesses or will they not? Will they be inclined? They represent states where Hillary Clinton won, and yet a Republican won the senatorial campaign. So they have different influences on them than other states have. And what does that come down to? It's the Senate balance of power. And, you have, a minor change, 4 changes, and it changes from Republican to Democrat. If you look at the House, I'll finish with, these are Senate races that I think that I'm cluing in on watching. Doug Jones from Alabama, that's an example of Republicans fighting and ending up so damaged that when they get to the general, they can't win. Alabama's a Republican state. It should have a Republican senator. They don't. Susan Collins from Maine, because, she's Susan Collins and it's Maine. Marsha McSally, Arizona. Arizona has been thrown all up in a tempest, and I attribute it to, the whole John McCain, Trump, fights and antagonism, that it's really flavored over into what you would consider a traditionally Republican state. Gary Peters from Michigan, I put him up there because Michigan did go for Trump, squeaky, but and he's a Democrat, but I don't think he's nearly under the impression that, say, a Doug Jones is. And then lastly, I'll point out Ed Markey. He is a good example of the new Democratic left coming after traditionally liberal Democrats because it's a time for change. And Ed Markey is a very traditional liberal Democrat. He co-sponsored the Green New Deal. Massachusetts will not go Republican, no matter who wins, is my prediction. But it definitely causes a lot of heartburn in the party. House races, if you look at House races, 232 Democrats, 197 Republicans. Again, you're seeing the 230, 190. And Democrats won 40 seats this last election. Those are the ones that are going to most be focused on in this next election. And I will again highlight, Ocasio-Cortez and the progressive wing's effect on the Democratic Party, where you are seeing traditionally liberal Democrats being challenged by even more progressive Democrats. And it's people like, Elliot Engel, Jerry Nadler, who you voice, if you watched impeachment, he's being primaried. And these are all people being primaried. You see the same thing to a lesser extent at this point in time on the Republican side, like Kay Granger, and I'll use her as an example, is being primaried by a very conservative Republican. Kay is the ranking Republican member on a House Appropriations Committee. You would think that that would be the last person you would want to challenge, but, you know, she's in the same spot as, you know, Richard Neal. He's chairman of of House Ways and Means. You're going to challenge that Ways and Means Committee? You know, okay. And then the other big thing that I find of interest is, you know, these uncertainties that are out there, like in Texas, we're seeing, you know, a half dozen or so members have retired, and what effect that will have, particularly on these districts that have a large urban, suburban representation. That's all I had.
All right, great.